Leonardo Martins, a 58-year-old former Army general, walked the streets of Manhattan like any other businessman. Tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair neatly cropped, he had the kind of presence that made people straighten up, even if they didn't know who he was. His dark suits were tailored but understated, his wristwatch more functional than flashy. Though he owned one of the most successful private banks in New York, Leonardo shunned the limelight. He preferred to let others assume he was just another well-dressed man in the city. It had been over a decade since he retired from the military, and the discipline, control, and sharp instincts that guided him on the battlefield now guided him in boardrooms. In contrast to the noise and chaos outside, Leonardo's world moved with calculated precision. His office, on the top floor of an unmarked building near Wall Street, was minimalist, adorned with only a few photos from his military days and a framed Medal of Honor. "You can't afford mistakes," he'd often remind his team, his voice calm but commanding. It was a reminder of the stakes he dealt with daily. Not bullets and bombs anymore, but numbers and deals. Despite his reserved nature, Leonardo was deeply observant. His brown eyes, often hidden behind thin-framed glasses, seemed to absorb every detail in a room. He had always been someone who listened more than he spoke, allowing others to underestimate him, an advantage he used to his benefit both in war and in business. But while his financial world flourished, Leonardo often encountered something in civilian life that rank and status couldn't shield him from: the assumptions people made based solely on appearance. Leonardo arrived at his bank early, as he often did, preferring to avoid the attention that came with peak hours. Dressed in his usual dark suit, he stepped out of the black sedan that blended into the city's constant flow of traffic. The bank itself, though one of the most successful in New York, was surprisingly modest in its design. Its exterior was sleek and modern, but it lacked the gaudy, imposing presence of other financial institutions nearby. Leonardo liked it that way. It mirrored his approach to life. Low profile, high efficiency. Inside, the bank's marble floors and glass walls reflected the morning light. It was still quiet, with only a few early-rising clients and staff moving about. Leonardo made his way past the front desk, nodding politely to the receptionist, who didn't realize he was the owner. To most, he was just another well-dressed businessman, and that suited him perfectly. He walked to a private meeting room, where he had scheduled a discussion with some of his top executives. As he waited, he glanced through the window at the city below. He wasn't just thinking about the day's agenda, though. His mind was always 10 steps ahead, planning for contingencies in a business world where anything could happen. The door opened quietly behind him. "Morning, Mr. Martins," a voice said, breaking his concentration. He turned and greeted his chief financial officer with a firm handshake, signaling the beginning of yet another day of high-stakes decisions. Mid-morning at the bank was typically uneventful, just the hum of business quietly moving forward. But today, that hum was broken when Officer Julio Ferreira walked in. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a hardened look, Ferreira was not someone who entered a room unnoticed. His badge, glinting from the sunlight streaming through the windows, marked him as an officer of the NYPD, but his reputation for being heavy-handed, particularly with people of color, preceded him in many circles. Ferreira had been called to the bank for a routine security issue, but as he entered, his eyes quickly locked onto Leonardo, standing near the front desk, reviewing some documents with an associate. Ferreira's gaze lingered a bit too long. A wealthy black man in a suit, but without an obvious air of importance, Ferreira immediately made assumptions. His prejudices simmered just below the surface as he approached, the confidence of his uniform shielding him from the nuances of decorum. "Hey, you," Ferreira called out, his voice cutting through the quiet buzz of the bank's operations. Leonardo didn't initially realize the officer was speaking to him. "Yeah, you," Ferreira repeated, his tone already aggressive. "What are you doing here? You look out of place." The words were sharp, accusing, dripping with condescension. Leonardo's associate froze, sensing the tension. Leonardo, calm but cautious, turned to face the officer. "Excuse me?" he replied, keeping his voice even, though there was a slight furrow in his brow. He knew this wasn't about security. It was about something far uglier, and it was starting to unfold right in front of him. The atmosphere in the bank grew tense as Officer Ferreira took a step closer to Leonardo, his hand resting on his utility belt. "I asked you what you're doing here," Ferreira repeated, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby staff and customers. His eyes narrowed, as if searching for a reason to escalate the situation. "You don't look like you belong in a place like this." Leonardo remained calm, though his patience was being tested. He was no stranger to situations of power and intimidation, having dealt with far worse in his military career. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his bank, and he was being treated like a suspect. "I'm here for business," Leonardo replied steadily, meeting the officer's stare. He could feel the weight of judgment in Ferreira's gaze, but he kept his composure. "That's not good enough," Ferreira shot back, stepping even closer, his posture aggressive. "Let me see some ID. Now." His tone left no room for negotiation, as if he already believed Leonardo was in the wrong. The people around them shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. Some customers looked on in silence, while others pretended not to notice, a familiar unease filling the room. The receptionist, who had been helping other clients, glanced nervously between the two men, sensing the confrontation was quickly spiraling. Leonardo took a slow breath, reaching into his jacket pocket for his wallet. He wasn't about to make a scene, but he wasn't going to be bullied either. "There's no need for this," he said calmly, handing over his ID. He knew full well this was a matter of prejudice, not security, but he let the situation play out, knowing it would reveal more about the officer than about himself. Leonardo handed over his ID, maintaining eye contact with Ferreira, who snatched the card with a flicker of impatience. As Ferreira scanned the ID, his expression didn't soften. Instead, it seemed to deepen his resolve, as if confirming a suspicion only he held. "Leonardo Martins," the officer muttered, his tone still laced with skepticism. "What kind of business do you have here, Martins?" Leonardo's calm demeanor remained intact. "I have several business interests in this bank," he replied evenly. He could see Ferreira wasn't processing the situation fully, his biases clouding any attempt at understanding. Leonardo wasn't ready to play all his cards yet. There was a deeper lesson to be taught, and rushing it would do no good. Ferreira's eyes narrowed as if he was waiting for Leonardo to trip up. "Several business interests, huh? Must be nice," Ferreira sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you're still going to need to come with me for questioning. You know, just to clear things up." Leonardo raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "I don't think that's necessary," he said, his tone controlled but firm. "You've seen my identification. I'm a client here, and there's no reason for any further action." But Ferreira, convinced of his own authority, leaned in closer. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice now a low, menacing growl. "Some people don't get to walk around here like they own the place." His words hung heavy in the air, and Leonardo understood exactly what the officer meant without it needing to be said aloud. Ferreira wasn't backing down. His ego had taken over, and he seemed determined to assert control over the situation, regardless of the facts. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said, his hand inching toward the cuffs at his belt. "You either cooperate and come with me quietly, or we'll do this the hard way." Leonardo, still composed but now fully aware that the situation was spiraling, stood his ground. His military training had taught him that sometimes the best course of action was to observe, to let things unfold. But he also knew when a line had been crossed. This officer, blinded by prejudice, was now threatening to take him into custody based on nothing but assumptions. Before Leonardo could respond, the bank's manager, Ana Clara, hurried over. Her heels clicked loudly on the marble floor as she approached, her face a mix of concern and confusion. She had been watching the interaction from a distance, but hadn't realized how far it had gone until now. "Officer," she began, her voice firm but respectful, "is there a problem here?" Ferreira barely acknowledged her, still focused on Leonardo. "Just taking care of some suspicious behavior," he said dismissively. "This man doesn't seem to belong here." Ana Clara's eyes widened, and she immediately understood what was happening. Without hesitation, she stepped between the two men. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Mr. Martins isn't just a customer here. He's the owner of this bank. Ferreira's face twisted in confusion, then disbelief. "What did you say?" he asked, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "He owns the bank," Ana Clara repeated, her voice firm. "He's not just a client. He's the reason this bank exists." Ferreira's posture shifted from aggression to bewilderment as Ana Clara's words sank in. He stood frozen for a moment, processing what he had just heard. The bank's owner? The same man he had been threatening to arrest and drag out like a common criminal? His face flushed, a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment rising within him. He glanced down at the ID in his hand once more, but this time with new eyes. "The owner," he stammered, his bravado fading fast. Leonardo remained composed, watching the officer's reaction with quiet restraint. He hadn't needed to say a word to defend himself. The truth had spoken for him. "Yes," Leonardo finally said, breaking the silence. "I'm the owner of this bank. And what you've just done," he paused, his voice still calm, but with a hint of steel, "is not something I take lightly." Ferreira's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He tried to salvage the situation, his tone quickly shifting to something more apologetic. "I didn't realize, sir," he muttered, glancing nervously between Leonardo and Ana Clara. "I thought—" "You thought I didn't belong here," Leonardo interrupted, his voice firm but not raised. The entire bank had gone silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. "You thought you could make assumptions about who I am based on how I look." Ferreira opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His confidence was gone, replaced by panic. He had misjudged not just Leonardo's status, but the entire situation, and now the consequences were closing in. As the weight of his mistake bore down on him, Ferreira's face reflected a mix of shame and fear. The bank's employees and customers, who had been silent witnesses to the confrontation, were now murmuring among themselves. Some had recorded the incident on their phones, and it was clear that Ferreira's behavior had not gone unnoticed. The officer glanced nervously at the growing crowd, realizing that his authority was slipping away. Ana Clara, standing beside Leonardo, gave Ferreira a hard, unblinking look. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable, Officer Ferreira. You've not only disrespected Mr. Martins, but you've also created a scene in front of our clients. This will be reported." Ferreira's mouth went dry. "Please," he started, his voice unsteady. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who he was." His attempt at damage control only seemed to deepen the severity of the situation. Leonardo, still composed but clearly done with the officer, stepped forward. "Knowing who I am isn't the issue," he said firmly. "The issue is how you treated me when you thought I was just another customer. You acted with prejudice, and now you're facing the consequences." At that moment, one of the senior bank executives entered the room, followed closely by a security team. They approached Leonardo and Ana Clara, clearly informed about the incident. Without missing a beat, Ana Clara addressed them. "We need to file a formal complaint against Officer Ferreira for harassment and misconduct." Ferreira's face went pale. "Please, I didn't mean," he started again, but Leonardo raised a hand to stop him. "This is out of your hands now," Leonardo said coldly. "The authorities will handle it from here." The wheels of justice began to turn quickly. Within hours of the incident, Ana Clara had filed a formal report with the NYPD's Internal Affairs Department, detailing the harassment and racial profiling that had taken place. The bank's security footage and witness statements were handed over as evidence, leaving little room for doubt about what had transpired. For Officer Ferreira, the situation had gone from bad to worse. Leonardo, though deeply offended by the event, maintained his focus on the larger issue at hand. This wasn't just about him. It was about holding those in positions of authority accountable for their actions, especially when their biases impacted innocent people. He had faced adversity and injustice before, but this time, it felt different. As the owner of a major financial institution and a man of influence, he knew he had the power to ensure Ferreira's actions didn't go unchecked. A few days later, Ferreira was summoned for an internal review. The pressure from the media, along with the growing number of people who had witnessed or heard about the confrontation, left the NYPD with no choice but to act. Ferreira was placed on administrative leave while an official investigation into his conduct was launched. Leonardo didn't relish in the officer's downfall, but he knew it was necessary. "This isn't about revenge," he explained to Ana Clara after the news broke. "It's about accountability. People like him need to understand that their actions have real consequences, especially when they abuse their power." Weeks later, the investigation concluded, and the verdict was clear. Officer Ferreira was found guilty of misconduct and racial profiling. The consequences were swift. He was dismissed from the police force. His career in law enforcement abruptly ended. For Ferreira, the reality of his actions hit hard. He had misused his power and allowed prejudice to dictate his behavior, and now he was paying the price. Leonardo followed the developments closely, but he wasn't looking for personal vindication. The legal action had never been about revenge for him. It was about making a statement, a stand against the kind of systemic racism that often went unchallenged. He had faced prejudice throughout his life, even as a decorated military general and successful businessman, and he knew that many others who didn't have his status faced even worse. As the dust settled, Leonardo took time to reflect on what had happened. "No one," he said quietly one evening, speaking to Ana Clara in the privacy of his office, "is above the law, and no one should be judged by the color of their skin, no matter where they come from or what they do." Ana Clara nodded. She had witnessed firsthand the ugliness of bias and the strength it took for Leonardo to rise above it. "You handled it with more grace than most would have," she said softly. Leonardo smiled faintly. "Grace is learned through adversity," he replied. "And we have to teach the world that no matter how much power you have, it's never enough to excuse injustice." The story ended not with a triumphant victory, but with a sobering reminder that the fight for equality and justice is ongoing. And though Leonardo had won this battle, he knew there were many more ahead, for him, for others, and for a world that still had a long way to go. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, turn on notifications, and watch the next video we're recommending for you on the screen.